Hello, I'm Peter Ninemire, and this is my first episode of Justice Reinvestment. This is my podcast that's going to be about reinventing and reshaping the way that we deal the criminal justice system, and we as a society deal with people that have substance use and mental health disorders. I come by my work really honestly. I came from being third on the most wanted list in the state of Kansas in 1991 to today. I'm the owner and director of the Caring Center of Wichita. We're a behavioral health substance use disorder practice that works with people that have mental health and substance use disorders. So how and where did this journey begin where I ended up being third on the most wanted list in Kansas? Well, I grew up in rural northwestern Kansas, really desolate area, and it was a really troubled time in our country at that time. It was 1960, 1970. The Vietnam War was going on, and there was just a lot of anxiety, and there was a lot of protest about this because people were being indiscriminately largely drafted and taken there. So anyhow, the protest movement at that time was all about drugs and revolution, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And I was all about that, okay? I like that part of it. And, back where I grew up in those days, like if you smoked marijuana in 1969 in Lenore, Kansas, you were crazy. And you know what? I was a rebel. That's who I identified at. And, the first time I smoked pot, and guess what? This farm I was at in northwestern Kansas, a lot of marijuana grew on that farm. And I remember, I should say that a part of all this is I grew up just in the shadow of the Catholic Church and an authoritarian father that was a loving, caring father, but him and I had a tremendously, terribly conflicted relationship. And I grew up as one of 8 kids, and I remember being on the banks of this Solomon River at one time, and my little brothers were talking across the creek about not telling me about something. And I'm like, well, I'm going to come across there and blah, blah, blah. And said, well, I just didn't tell my brother what you were going to do because there was marijuana growing, because I was thinking you'd probably try it. Like, well, I already have. So anyhow, I just, most people would have been, hey, I'm good. I tried it. It was wild weed. It didn't do anything for me, but not this kid. This kid was like, there's got to be more to it than that. And sure enough, here I am at the shelter outside of Lenore at the little lake we had. And there's this guy from Vietnam came home, and his name was Tit. Everybody called him Terry now. Anyhow, Tit says to me, hey, Pete, you want to get ripped? And I'm like, yeah. And I didn't know what the hell he was talking about. I figured it was booze, but, I was game. So he had some Nam weed. And I tried this Nam, that's Vietnamese weed. And the first time I tried it, I went, whoa. Man, I'm not going to get pissed at the old man anymore. I'm just going to get stoned. And I thought I had it all figured out, and guess what? Throughout most of my high school years and for a long time thereafter, that was what I did. When I was a freshman in high school, I got kicked out of high school 3 times my freshman year and expelled the last day of it. And they liked my parents. They got me back into it. And ultimately, I graduated. But some really, things happened, profound things happened throughout my life, high school years. And one of them was in my senior year, my oldest brother is a priest. My second oldest brother was a really troubled soul. And he had, so many different things going on, and he was extremely odd and as social as I am. He was an introvert, and in retro, I think he was definitely on the spectrum. And him and my dad would do whatever for him. He grew up hard scrabble, and it was just a battle. But him and my mom found my brother at Fort Hays State University in the dormitory with the windows open, middle of January, curled up in a fetal position. And they took him to 4th floor Hadley to get him help. And he got him on medications. Lewis went in and out of the hospital. He went in and out of medication. He came home. He struggled, continued to struggle. And I remember coming home one night late, and he was at the kitchen table with my parents, and he was crying like a little child, like a 7-year-old child. And I was, wow, and I I was really I wanted to help him. I had empathy for him, and starting to for my dad. My dad was struggling so much, and my mother, her soul was tormented with this. And so at one time, I remember in May of 1973, I was farming right below Coffin Rock Ranch out there, and I had this horrible premonition that my brother was going to take his life, and I couldn't do anything about it. Sure enough, my dad went to a co-op board meeting that night. Lewis was roaming around the farm after he beat me in a game of basketball. He was non-communicative. I called Dad. He came home. Lewis had already made whatever decision. He took some pills, and I was in the bathtub. Dad had invited me to go with him to the hospital, and I heard a shriek I'll never forget. It was a shriek of my mother in horror as my brother Lewis jumped off the balcony of our farmhouse without putting his hands out head first onto the cement sidewalk below and took his life. The next morning, I'll never forget, I watched my father cleaning up his son's blood from that sidewalk, and the animosity and, almost hatred and whatever I had as a troubled kid with my father at that time began to dissipate as I just couldn't, imagine the pain. I felt that pain that I didn't understand. And in the next few years after that, my dad, I was on a harvest crew. He kept writing me. He kept blaming himself. He never let it go. And a few years later, it would have been actually 4 years later, after 2 years later, my father came down with cancer, terminal cancer. And he had really been pretty healthy most of his life. And I wonder about the correlation there. But he ultimately came down with cancer. And in the meantime, I'd been out on the road. I got my degree. I was a DJ, into whatever sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It was mostly drugs and rock and roll. But, it was a crazy life at that time. I kept using marijuana. But when Dad came down sick, I came back from Oklahoma and where I was working in radio, and I wanted to be around him last couple of years. And I got a job with a satellite TV station out in northwestern Kansas, where I was a TV engineer because I had a first-class FCC license. So ultimately what happened is that I remember when Dad was on his deathbed and he came out and he says to me, "Son, I don't know I know you've been out picking marijuana." And sure enough, I was figuring out how to brick it and sell it or whatever at the ripe old age of 22 years old. I continued to use and then sell marijuana, and that became kind of a mainstay for me. But he said, "Son," I said, "Oh, Dad, that's bullshit," and he said, "Son, I don't know anything about drugs and marijuana, but I have this terrible premonition that someday you're going to go to prison, and for a long time, for marijuana." That was in May of 1973, and I said, "Dad, that's bullshit." Sure enough, right after that, I quit my job at the television station. I hated it. It didn't fit me. I didn't fit it. I moved to Hayes. I moved in with a crowd down there that was using drugs there, and I was already selling marijuana. And one of the guys that became one of my closest friends, lifelong friends, thankfully changed his life long before I did, but they were all into the whole drug world. And so at that particular time, I got introduced to what was Peruvian flake cocaine, which crazily was in Hayes, Kansas, and some of the purest form of that. And it was really, really good and really, really bad. But it wasn't just that. Along this whole time, I was really devoutly intent on learning to grow marijuana because it's costing me a fortune. And, I've got to figure out a way to do this. So I ultimately meet this guy that is his father's alcohol dependent, just a raging alcoholic. People would say I don't use those terms really. But anyhow, Rob was his name, and Rob ran the streets of Hayes and ran the country wild. And when he was doing that at one point in time, he stumbled across the next door neighbors or some of the neighbors' land, and on that land grew some marijuana. And the marijuana grew because this farmer was trying to save his crop at that time because the banker wouldn't loan him the money to save the crop. And this farmer, so whenever he stumbled onto that land, they were already friends, and him and his son were like best friends. So we had to take him in, and they grew 1,700 pounds of marijuana. And during this time, I didn't know it until later, but the dad and the son were trying to figure out how to make honey oil and hash oil, and they had this contraption that they were doing it on, and it blew up, and it burned his son over 95% of his body, mostly third degree burns, and this son survived that. Rob started selling the marijuana. I ran into Crazy Pete. We were quite a match. So all of a sudden, here I am, 22 years old, 6 months after my dad passed, and I'm on the road. And I'm like a drug dealing, marijuana growing vagabond. And everybody's like giving Pete a house because he's bringing drugs and he's got the cocaine. And, I'm fronting out, getting marijuana fronted to me, 30, 40 pounds. So I'm taking it back to Oklahoma City, Wichita, Kansas City, knew a few people in Denver. And my life was spiraling out of control within 6 months of my father's passing. And a couple of years later, it was in 1981, July 1981, that my dad died in 78, that I was in Catherine, Kansas, town out south, northeast of Hayes, and was waiting for a guy to come out there with my friends. And I had a half a pound. My friend had a half a pound of this flake cocaine, and we were going to give it to him. And, back in the day when I was doing it, it was all the people, we were all buddies, we didn't have any guns. We didn't have any of that stuff. We just dealt and did drugs. And anyhow, what happened was I was living at this house, and when I moved in there was an abandoned car, and I found the car keys to the trunk. And I'm like, okay, if I need to stash any weed, man, this is perfect because they can't prove it's my car, blah, blah, blah. Well, sure enough, what happened was I had 100 pounds of Mexican weed in the trunk of that car, and these kids, next door neighbors, were playing on that car, popped the trunk open, found a kilo, took it over next door took it over to their home to Pops and said, Pops, what's this? And Pops said, it's time to call the police. And he did. And that's whenever I was out there and my house was surrounded in this remote area. And I'm like, I think they're here for me. Well, sure enough, they were. We had a 6-hour search that night. Back in the day, we were high. I was doing drugs while they were searching the house. My buddy's telling me I'm not going to jail, and I'm pretty sure I am. There's 100 pounds of weed, and they hadn't found the half a pound of cocaine until midnight. And I heard these cops shouting out, drug sniffing dog, drug sniffing dog. I'm like, oh no. Sure enough, some random dog in the neighborhood smelled the chicken bones, Kentucky Fried Chicken bones box that my buddy put that in and brought out and put it underneath a heavy cinder block, drug it out in front of the cops, and there I was, busted for sure. So I end up with 100 pounds of weed and a half a pound of pure cocaine that my attorney, thank God, did a great job. Thank you, Don. He got that set. Like, how can we put anybody, there's been too much common area that's been around for 6 hours. I got that thrown out. I pled guilty to the weed, and I got my first felony, lost my FCC license, and my family come down and said, okay, Pete, we know this is all BS, and you need to change we got to make some changes. And, I thought I was going to make some changes. I figured, okay, it looks like I got to quit smoking weed. That's going to be hard, but, I got to do it. And I met this PO named Ed, Uncle Ed Pfeiffer, and he was the nicest guy. And I think we all affectionately called him Uncle Ed, because back in the day, he believed what I told him, that I was going to quit smoking marijuana, but I never. And it was a lot harder than I thought. And what happened was he told me, Pete, the one thing I do need is I need a pay stub. So I got a job on an oil rig with a buddy of mine. And of course, I sold him drugs and the other people that worked on the oil rig. And I got the pay stubs going. But before long, I found a college kid to come out and do my job on the rig. And so I got the pay stub and he got the paycheck. He got the cash and I got the stub. And I was sending that into my PO. So here I am, man. I got to go ahead and do my dream. No sooner had I done that. And within a matter of months, I'm already plotting with this farmer that I had lined up to grow a marijuana crop while I'm working on his farm. And I had a buddy of mine that was out there. We moved in a coachman trailer. We grew a marijuana crop. So I go to Florida with about 100 pounds of marijuana. and I traded off for cocaine because what happened was a good buddy of mine, I grew up in northwestern Kansas, Wild Ronnie, he was living in Miami. He was an independent spirit. He was abused as a child. He was a mixed kid, Korean descent. His dad married his mom, came out there. He grew up a fighter and a survivor. He was making $100,000 plus a year working at a car dealership in Miami, Florida in 1982 or 3 or whatever. So I'm down there, mind you, on probation, picking up kilos of cocaine with my buddy Rob, bringing him back to Kansas. And that fall, I get home and I've got a letter in the mailbox and it says my probation has been terminated. I'm like, what for? I broke the law practically every day I was on probation. Sure enough, I opened it, I opened it up, that's what it says. So I called Uncle Ed up on Monday morning and said, Ed, what's this letter, man? How could I, what do you mean my probation's been terminated? He said, it has, Pete. Congratulations. You've done everything you needed to do to successfully complete probation and you're free to go. And I don't even know, but when my dad died, the first reins came off of a wild horse. But whenever that happened, the reins really came off of a wild horse. So for the next 5 years, I was really a drug dealing, marijuana growing vagabond. I was going from in Kansas, growing pot here, taking it out to Northern California, getting a lot more money for it out there, selling it, and getting hooked up with people up in the Golden Triangle, learning all about growing marijuana. And it was pretty crazy out there. And by the way, I'm not proud of none of this, but I was bringing cocaine back and my life was out of control. And I'm bringing cocaine back. I've come back to Kansas ultimately after about 5 years. I bring these guys back from California, and they were like, how to know how to do it and all this, blah, 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 the soil and all that. And so anyhow, we're down in eastern Kansas, and we're at a farmhouse where there's 4 dudes. Nobody's got a job. And, I'm right across the street. I grew up on the farm, we're right across the road from another farmer with 4 dudes, California plates, nobody's working, motorcycles, you name it. So anyhow, what we didn't know was that there was a weekend cowboy there that was also a sheriff's deputy in Ottawa. And he couldn't help but take a look over this picket fence that this guy built, a brand new picket fence around a 100-year-old chicken coop, which was stupid. And that made me stupid because you're only as strong as your weakest link, I always said, but I always hung with a real weak link. But anyhow, people on drugs. And anyhow, so we get busted with 1,800 transplants, go to trial, and took them all of 45 minutes. I get convicted, second charge for that. But my attorney came and told me this, I'm going to let you in on a little secret. This is a bad career choice. And if you get busted again, they are going to cut a certain piece of your anatomy that he listed to me off. And I kind of knew a little bit about that, but at this point in time, I'm 7, 8, 9 years into this project, and I just couldn't my whole life, and I had to cash in. That's the way I seen it. And so we went to court. I got a 4 to 10 year sentence in the state of Kansas, but I was able to stay out on appeal bond because the cop looked over the sheriff looked over that fence, and he did not have a search warrant to do so. So here I am, out on appeal bond, looking a 4.5 year state sentence, and the walls were closing in. And I started looking at it like, okay, I got to do this now or never. And sure enough, I go. What happens is I bring this group back, another guy back from California with me, and he had a heroin problem, and I never had any clue about that, but I got to learn a lot about that. And I was getting him, he formerly was one of the bigger drug dealers at 20-some years old in Northern California, and he met a guy named Shadiyar who was from Iran, who, by the way, was heroin, had access to heroin. And so anyhow, we grew a crop the next year, and so we took that out there, and he ultimately ended up getting busted in California with that. And so we ended up, we were going to do it one more time, and we grew a crop on Pomona Lake, and we grew about 500 plants. And so we were looking at between 500 to 1,000 pounds, and this was going to be, and I wanted to get away from him. I was starting to hate my life. I was around all these people, and the only way I could see out of it was have a big haul, make $1 million, start laundering it, and my life really became consumed, out of control, and basically I was captured in my own prison at this time. So anyhow, that year, we went to do a drug deal, a couple 100 pounds of pot. These people I'd been dealing with in California that my buddy didn't like, had grievance with, they came out. I ended up in the, in front with a 45 in my face, and they took a couple 100 pounds from us, tied the 4 people up I had working for me in the house out on Golden Shores Drive in Manhattan, Kansas, and anyhow, at that time was where we were living. And so anyhow, we got ripped off. They went to California. I don't know how anybody didn't get shot up then, but that didn't happen. So we had to do it one more time. So I grew a crop at Golden Shores Drive in Manhattan, Kansas, about 350 plants on right outside of that. Well, right out back of our pad on the lake. And my buddy, who had just been indicted for the largest cocaine bust, 11 kilos of cocaine in Wichita history at that time, came out, and he said, "Pete, you have no idea, bro, but if you get busted again, you're going to get a mandatory minimum. Like I just got a 25-year sentence." And I kind of knew what he's saying, but I wasn't hearing nothing ain't going to happen to me. I always said that. Sure enough, within a matter of a week or two later, I flew back from California. I had dinner with my brother, Father Carey, at the Hyatt in San Francisco. 2 days later, a day or so later, I was calling him from jail because I had met about the entirety of the Riley County Police Department that were standing on my neck. And then I got to find out what my attorney told me about that piece of anatomy, which was that I was now looking at a federal mandatory minimum 20.5-year minimum prison sentence with 4.5 more years for my criminal history. And I was looking at going to prison minimum 25 years. So the walls were closing in. And I ultimately made the decision that I was looking at either becoming a fugitive or going to prison at the age of 35 for most, if not all, the rest of my life. And I became a fugitive. And I went on the run. I went to Northern California. I ended up crisscrossing the country, grew a pot crop while I was on the run. That's all I knew, bro. That's all I knew. So I ended up in South Florida. I was getting ready. I'd met some other people, and you can take for whatever you want from this, but my goal was to go to Bolivia. And I was up to no good there too. But anyhow, my life had spiraled that far out of control. At one time, I had 13 people that were fugitives from 4 different countries, and that was the gist of it. But I knew people in Miami too, and they were drug dealers. And that's what it amounted to. So those were the worst times of my life. Being on the run, never thinking, never ever going to see my mother again, my family, a lot of close friends that I was really close with. And if I would have been suicidal then, I would have taken my life. But my plan was, if the cops were ever going to get me, they could shoot me and take me out that way. But I guess, thank God, and I do mean that never happened. So it's a long story of how I got busted, but ultimately on February the 8th of 1991, I was running my buddy, the same buddy, his dogs at a local park. They thought I was him. I got pulled over. I had a fake ID, gave him the wrong ID, gave him my wrong birth date. They told me I didn't know my birth date, and you can imagine what I said to them on that. You gotta have a response to that, not knowing your birth date, especially when you're a fugitive looking at 25 years minimum. So anyhow, I get busted. That was it. That was that, and I got rescued. I could have said arrested, but that was a defining point in my life. And I got rescued. I got extradited back to Wichita, Kansas. And they had me and my buddy coming back as number 1 and 3 on Kansas. They said, can 2 of Kansas' native sons return home? They weren't too proud of us. And there wasn't much to be proud of. But anyhow, at that point in time, I got shipped out to a little jail at Jackson County. It was in Holton, Kansas. And I mean, I have to tell you that from being on the run and being that isolated and that alone, it felt great to be back in touch with my family and to have a life and, just to be in contact, human connection, because we're all, especially me, neurobiologically wired to be in connection with other people. And so I end up in this county jail that reminds me of Barney and whatever. It was, Mayberry RFD. And they were fattening us up there, whatever. But I walk in, meet this crazy guy named Shane. And right away, I could tell, man, this kid was trouble. And he says, Pete, we got to get the hell out of here. I'm looking at an 8-year sentence for bank robbery. You're looking at 27 years with 2.5 land added on for failure to appear for my sentence, and the 4 to 10 year sentence added on for being on appeal bond and running from that. So here I am with another horrible choice. Do I try to break out of jail with this kid and again go back on the run, or live the rest of my time in prison knowing coulda, woulda, shoulda? So I plotted with him to break out of this county jail, and we were all but with a couple of days of doing it. And the police, the federal marshals take a guy that had 2 years left on his sentence into court in Topeka, and he didn't want to do those 2 years. And he told them that me and Shane were planning on breaking out of that jail. So sure enough, middle of the night, 4 a.m., they came into the cell and said, hey, Ninemire, roll him up. And I already knew this because they actually crazily had told one of the guys they took to court that they were going to do that. So anyhow, middle of the night, I end up on the way to a place that I remember being high on drugs, drunk, crazy, driving, doing the marijuana drug thing. And we got stuck with cops following us by Leavenworth and Lansing State Prison. But this time, that omnibus sign then came to reality, and I ended up in segregated housing. Basically, it was solitary confinement at the United States Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas. And finally, I knew that I could no longer run from myself and the wreckage and the mess I had made of my life. And I had to do something to change. And like I tell a lot of people, it's never too late to change, but I hope you don't wait as long as I did, okay? So I'm in prison there. While I'm there, I get this newsletter in this. And so I got moved over into D-cell block. It was horror. It was one hell of a place. But anyhow, I get the first ray of hope that I had, and it was from Families Against Mandatory Minimums. And they were about letting the punishment fit the crime. And that's what, I was. I thought, I broke the law and I deserved to be punished. But, the punishment for me and so many Black and brown young men at that time that were getting 25-year prison sentences did not match the crime. And so anyhow, I ended up at a federal prison in Colorado. It was a medium security prison, FCI Inglewood. And while I was there, started raising money for Families Against Mandatory Minimums. We actually became empowered through card sales. We raised enough money to send a toxicologist to Washington, D.C. to testify on behalf of FAM about the disparity between crack and cocaine, crack cocaine and powder cocaine sentences. But out of that program grew a lot of things, and I began to evolve, and I began to change. I began to finally started giving myself, I was so angry and upset at the craziness of my prison sentence that I never gave myself credit for working really hard to get there, right? And so you just kind of heard there was a lot of work that went into that. But ultimately, I began taking accountability, seeing the role I played, experiencing what I was experiencing. And out of all this evolved an opportunity to help establish a prison youth counseling program that changed my life. So I did this for a number of years, but I want to say that one of the last things that happened at that prison that was, not last, but things that was really monumental was that I got high there for the last time in my life on marijuana. I'd been there in prison and I had another stint at a couple of other places, smoked pot about 4 or 5 times, never got stoned, worried about whether I was going to get a hot UA. It was a pin roll, and $10 was like $100 then. So anyhow, this crazy kid named Joe P. out of San Diego talked me into smoking some The Kind, and I didn't want to smoke The Kind. I didn't really give a whatever about it, but I did, and I got stoned. And I'm lying there on my bunk bed looking up at fluorescent lights in federal prison in a gymnasium where we were at because we won a lawsuit against the feds for housing us in a place that had asbestos and lead poisoning. Now, lead, whatever. I didn't care about that. I just cared about how long they wanted to keep me there. But anyhow, I'm lying there on that bunk bed looking up at them fluorescent lights, and I'm just thinking about how the first time I smoked marijuana, I was 14 years old. And the reason that I'm here has a lot more to do with the fact that I started smoking this substance then. And no matter what happened, 1, 2, 3 bus, being on the run, being a fugitive, I couldn't quit smoking it. And in that moment, I was filled with guilt and shame, thinking about coming from a great family in northwestern Kansas and how I ended up in prison going to be doing most, if not all, the rest of my life there. And I would have, except for some unbelievable things that happened. And that started in maybe around September of 2000, when my dreaded most thing happened. The thing I dreaded most happening while I was in prison was my mother died unexpectedly. And it set off a whole chain of events that included my buddy Ronnie, the guy that I told you I used to go to Miami, stopping by and really pushing me to apply for a commutation of sentence. And I didn't even know what the hell that meant. And the first time he talked to me was before Mother had passed. And the next time I had called him, he asked me, "Did you get that letter off to Bill?" And I said, "Bill?" He said, "Clinton." And I'm like, "Ronnie, we've been working on these sentences for 10 years, not 10, but 7, 8 years since he's been there. And bite my tongue, there's been nothing happen yet." And he said, "Well, Pete, if you don't do it for yourself, you need to do it unless you found your comfort zone. You need to do it for yourself and your family. You need to do it for your family, myself, and a lot of friends and people out here that care a lot about you." So once he invoked my family into it and my friends, the next day I went in and I have filed a commutation of sentence with President Bill Clinton. And on the greatest day of my life, January the 20th, 2001, I received a presidential commutation of sentence from former President William Jefferson Clinton, and I became a free man. And that is in large part, tremendously thanks to Families Against Mandatory Minimums that I worked with while I was in prison, and Marilyn Truby, my U.S. government public defender, who stuck by my side during my whole time in federal prison. So I get out of prison, I've got 4 felonies and no degree, and I want to work with kids, and things aren't going well, but I'm writing grants and I'm failing the grants, and it's just going on and on. So ultimately what happens is I decide through FAM, and FAM put me to work for them, and one of the people working for them told me about getting a substance abuse license that would help me work with kids. So I went to Butler County Community College, got my drug and alcohol certification, and I fell in love with social work. And ultimately, while I was getting my master's degree in social work, I got sent to a conference down in Birmingham, Alabama by Families Against Mandatory Minimums. And this conference was significantly held there to correlate the discrimination between addiction the racial discrimination of the 1960s before and beyond, and addiction. And with the perception of addiction being a criminal justice, public safety issue rather than a public health issue. Because at that conference, I learned how and why addiction was a disease that nobody had ever been able to tell me. And real simply, it's because it disrupts critical brain structures that control judgment, decision-making, and behavior. But there was a Dr. Merrill Norton that presented the hijacking of the human brain that day. And I was upset that we had to take a break over lunch. I was mesmerized by it because this presentation spoke to my experience. The science matched my experience perfectly. And ladies and gentlemen, what it did was it helped me understand the last time that I smoked marijuana, and really I'm telling you will ever smoke marijuana, it helped me understand that it wasn't what was wrong with me. It was what happened to me in terms of that disruptive critical brain structures and the way I managed my emotions, the way I managed my father's rage whenever he was mad, whenever he disciplined. And my father, like my brother Kerry told me when I was in prison, that Dad had a lot of stressors going on and too often disciplined in a fit of rage. And those fits of rage were kind of some of the starts of my anxiety. And I want to make this very clear that my father was a good man that did everything he could and did the best for me with what we had at that time. And that's what I find people do today. But today, all of this stuff, I got through with that. I ultimately had the honor of my life being the addiction treatment supervisor and mental health therapist for the Sedgwick County Drug Court. And I work in that collaborative justice approach in a therapeutic alliance to help people change their lives. And it's through this that I'm part of with my dear friend doing as a memorial to her Justice Reinvestment. And Nancy is a person that was formerly the youngest woman ever to be a warden of a maximum security prison, and her and I united later in both of our lives to work toward justice reinvestment. And that was Nancy's motto, and that is what my podcast is about. And a lot of future episodes, I'm looking forward to interviewing people from all different types of walks of life. A lot of them have to do with the criminal justice system. And I'll leave it at this, is in 2008-9, when I was with the drug court, I had one of the greatest honors of my life, and that was being invited to present to the Sedgwick County District Attorney's Office a 5-part series on the neuroscience of addiction as a disease. And that's a big part of my reinvestment and understanding, reinventing how we treat people with substance use and mental health disorders, and understanding that these are disorders and a disease. So today you got to hear my wild story from addiction, from childhood to addiction to prison. But in the future, as I work on this whole thing of justice reinvestment, I'm going to be interviewing a lot of people both in the criminal justice system and in the treatment for substance use disorders, and how we can most effectively help people change their lives in a therapeutic alliance in collaborative justice with these entities that we are working together in reshaping our criminal justice system for what I call justice reinvestment.